I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for having me on the program.
Not a problem, not a problem. I myself am a fan. I mean, when I first saw the series Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, I was like, wow, okay, finally we're going to get some knowledge out there, something to get people, connected to the history of this planet in a way that they weren't taught in school. So I was really excited about it. And then, of course, you came along, and I was like, well, this guy is really passionate. And I'm really actually excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today, just from coming out of that past alone. Now, let me ask you a question. When was your first aha moment when you were, you were involved in the bodybuilding, and then you went, I guess, from there into being an ancient astronaut researcher and a writer. What was that aha moment for you when you made that leap or that connection to the fact that, wow, this is something I want to give myself to?
Well, I mean, the bodybuilding, there was no aha moment. The ancient alien theory has been with me since I was a little kid. And the bodybuilding, like many of us have had or have day jobs, that was my day job for 6 years. I organized professional bodybuilding contests in the United States. And, so that was my day job. I mean, my love, my passion was always ancient aliens. And the moment when I was able to quit my job, I quit my job, which was bodybuilding, and I ran to the ancient aliens. So, it's truly amazing how the world works when, you have a day job, and then all of a sudden people wonder, how is it possible if someone goes from bodybuilding to ancient aliens, when the reality of the matter is that ancient aliens way preceded any interest I've ever had about, bodybuilding or the promotion of that sport. So, and there all of a sudden there's this one Wikipedia entry, and everything is completely turned upside down. And it's really odd because the Wikipedia page was only started a couple of weeks ago, and in those 2 weeks, it's just been amazing what has happened. And it's just really, it's downright bizarre, and to be honest with you, laughable, because, whoever has read my real biography, which is at legendarytimes.com, clearly can read that I did own Pro Bodybuilding Productions. Yes, I did run professional bodybuilding contests for 6 years, but I myself, with my small frame, I've never been an amateur bodybuilder. I would have made a total fool out of myself had I put on the thongs and put on the oil if I would have gone on stage. I would have been absolutely laughable.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, I've seen some of the pictures on Facebook. You do look pretty jacked up, or did look pretty jacked up at the time.
Yeah, but that's nothing like today's bodybuilders. I mean, I would have placed dead last. I would have been behind dead last.
Of course. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I've seen the competitions myself. But let me ask you then, okay, so fine. Let's go back to when you were a kid. All right. Where did it grab you then? What grabbed you about it?
Well, the way it grabbed me as a kid was essentially where, I had the great privilege of traveling the world with my parents, and they pretty much went to every country in the world, and I was able to tag along. And then my parents made sure that whenever we went to a foreign country, we would visit all of the museums, or most of the museums in the capital cities, but then also we would go out in the field to some of these archaeological sites where my dad especially made sure that we would get some guided tours by some local archaeologists and things like this. And then, every time I would come back home, my grandma, she would say, it's really cool that you were able to experience these things, but let me tell you, there's another alternative viewpoint on these subjects out there, especially on some of these archaeological sites. And so I was introduced to the ancient astronaut theory and the alternative viewpoint at a very early age, where my grandma, she's the one that, who introduced me to, like, Atlantis.
Wow.
And, the ghostly realm and things like this. And to be honest with you, that type of conversation, or that type of those types of discussions about how mysterious our ancient past is and things like that, that was, in my upbringing, that was dinner table conversation. So, even though, sometimes my parents still today, well, not today, I mean, but like a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, my parents would ask me, what are you wasting your time for with this ancient alien thing? And but I got to be honest with you, they're to blame. They started it all because they're the ones, who talked about these things all the time, and so here we are. But it wasn't really ever like an aha moment. It was basically just that I was introduced to these topics at a fairly early age through my grandma, and so to me, an aha moment never even existed because it was pretty much always, in my opinion, something that I inherently accepted.
So you accepted the existence of extraterrestrials then as a child. It wasn't a question to you then?
No question, no. Absolutely not. And
your family had no problem with it either then?
Well, I mean, that I would say now they don't, but for example, there's some people in my family who are devout Christians, and today they have no problem in believing in extraterrestrial life because here's my argument, and this has taken years and years of discussions and conversations where in Christianity, unfortunately, and not any religion today, mankind is regarded as the pinnacle of creation, as the as the apex of all of creation and things like this, and that there's nothing greater, nothing better than us, and that would be a pretty sad statement because we're not doing that well as a society right now, and the fact that extraterrestrials, if they exist, or that they exist, would only mean that creation was way more magnificent than even believed. So, creation equals God. What God is, who the heck knows? But the fact that other extraterrestrial, other life forms exist out there, that means that creation was even more amazing than what we, paid credit to.
But now I know that you've had people take you to task for, say, destroying their faith in, or maybe I'm being exaggerating, or certainly.
No, you're right. You're right, and that is not that is not my place in the world, because quite on the contrary, like I just tried to explain, in order to subscribe to the ancient alien theory, you don't have to lose your belief in God at all. On the contrary, it just makes it even more magnificent or bigger because it means we're not alone in the universe.
But you can't believe in the God of the Old Testament, though, because that will cause you some problems, apparently.
Well, that is, yeah, and therein lies the problem that, the ancient alien theory essentially, suggests that whatever or whoever was described in the Old Testament was not God, but an extraterrestrial, a flesh and blood extraterrestrial whom our ancestors, misunderstood for being God. Not because our ancestors were stupid, but because our ancestors, didn't understand the nuts and bolts technologies behind those visits. And so, personally, I'm a very deep believer in God. However, I don't necessarily, or not necessarily, but I do not believe in the God of the Old Testament, because the Old Testament God was an extraterrestrial. See, the idea of God varies from person to person. And then, yes, there's billions of people that say, they believe in one certain God, which is the God of the Old Testament.
Right.
But at the same time, I think the discussion should be, first, before we start any of this, what is your idea or your definition of God? And I can tell you right now that I do not believe, for example, in a personal God. So there's all these, minute yet pretty big differences in understandings or theories of God.
So where can a person know that subscribing, say, as they do, your understanding of the ancient astronauts connected to the Old Testament scriptures into the Indian writings and things like that. But where can they go then if they want to find out about the real God or the God above gods? Or I mean, they can't trust the Old Testament anymore. So now, where do they find the truth?
It's not necessarily about trusting the Old Testament anymore. I mean, look, the Old Testament, it's an incredible book with fantastic stories, and especially the New Testament. I mean, all the stuff that's written in there about Jesus. I mean, I've read the New Testament. I think it's wonderful. I think it's amazing. The thing is that you always have to go back further in time to look at the sources of all these different materials that we can read today, including the Bible. I mean, if one looks at the teachings of Jesus, and if one simultaneously looks at the teachings of the Buddha, then one has to come to the inescapable conclusion that they're essentially the same. And, one has to wonder, well, how is that even possible? And, some people have suggested that, who knows, Jesus might have spent a great portion of his adult life in India, learning under all these different swamis and gurus and teachers of Buddhism and Hinduism long before he came back and taught his teachings. Because one thing is crystal clear, that we see Jesus at the beginning of the New Testament. We see Jesus somewhere in between for a couple of pages, and then he essentially disappears until the crucifixion. And so there are numerous pieces of evidence that should suggest that Jesus, during that time, did visit Tibet, Nepal, India, all those different places in the Far East, to learn about what he wanted to do, because it cannot be denied that Jesus was, in fact, a historical figure. That is, neither here nor there. But where can people go to, read about spirituality? Of course you can still read the Bible. Of course you can still read the Quran. But with certain of those books, you have to understand that the great majority are based on a fabrication that was built around a once real visit of real extraterrestrials in the remote past.
Okay, that's very clear. And I appreciate you putting it that way, because that was actually one of the questions that I've always wanted to ask you, even for myself. Now, how did you meet up with Eric von Daniken?
Well, that was actually quite an interesting story, because I grew up initially in Switzerland, even though my grandpa and my great-grandpa, they're both from Queens, New York. I grew up part of my life in Switzerland, and Eric von Daniken, he is Swiss. He's a Swiss author, and he essentially, when I was in my early teens, I started to go and attend his lectures in Switzerland and in Germany and the surrounding countries there in Europe, and he essentially, became a friend of mine. And back in the late 1990s, when we had been friends for a very long time, he asked me, he said, we need someone new in the English-speaking world, because the guy that's publishing our magazine, which was at the time called Ancient Skies, he is stepping down. He is not necessarily resigning, but he wants to, he wants to retire, because he was in his 70s, and bless his heart, he'd been doing that for, over 20 years. And so, some people of the German AASRA, or the German Center for Ancient Astronaut Research, they essentially proposed to me whether or not I wanted to, be at the helm of this research society. And I grabbed the bull by its horns, and the rest, as they say, is history. That was
indeed. Are you still there?
Yes, that was back in 1998.
1998, yeah. And what a job. I mean, it just got kind of blown up over the last decade or so. I think it's really that time that people really begin to want to know a little bit more about their history and just about more about who they are. And I think in conjunction with all the talk about UFOs visiting the planet and people sighting them and the sites for UFO sightings and stuff, it just kind of just falls into place. It's almost like some grand, revealing, and this, the ancient astronaut theory is really a big part of it. Now, of all the places that you visited, and in terms of the ancient astronaut sites, now I think I know that Puma Punku is at the top of your list. Am I right there?
You are 100% correct, yes.
What's under that? Give me 4 places that are under that in terms of sites that really indicate and really support the evidence of ancient ETs.
Well, the other places, the second place would be a place in Peru called Ollantaytambo, and all of our listeners can go and Google that spot. It's spelled Ollantaytambo, Ollantaytambo, and it's this place that's pretty close to Machu Picchu in Peru, outside of Cusco. And also there, what we find are these amazing stone formations that we today would have great difficulties reproducing. And then in third place, I would say, Malta, the island of Malta, because there are some of the oldest megalithic sites that we can find on the planet, if not the oldest megalithic sites on the planet, can be found on the island of Malta, and they're absolutely massive megalithic temples.
That's like just a tiny little island. I mean,
exactly.
It has space for all of that on there.
Right. Well, I mean, yeah, they actually added to the island to be able to build this stuff. No, I'm just kidding.
No, yeah, right.
But,
that's New York, so whatever. Yeah.
With the landfills, exactly.
Right.
No, but the thing is that people they think gosh, it's probably the pyramid is the pyramids are the most amazing things, and true, you stand in front of those pyramids and they're absolutely magnificent. But there are other places around the world as well that are absolutely crazy. And in fact, if we were to talk about Egypt, I would pick a site called Abusir over the pyramids, because, for example, at Abusir, which is a few hundred miles away from Giza, we have a place that is an ancient stone quarry, and in that stone quarry there are some remnants of tools that were used that have a complete machine-like signature, where the stone cutting techniques that were used there were not were not achieved by utilizing copper tools or chicken bones and things like this, but they display a clear signature of some type of tools that were done with some type of a machine, or that belonged to some type of a machine. Because here's the thing. Look, I am not suggesting that the pyramids were built by aliens. Of course, the pyramids were built by our ancestors, by our human ancestors, with their own sweat and blood. And I'm also not suggesting that our ancestors did not know how to cut stone, because, of course, our ancestors knew how to cut stone. In fact, in many museums around the world, we can see the stone cutting tools that are on display still today. And so, what I am suggesting, though, is that what our ancestors knew how to cut, the particular type of stone that they were able to cut, was very soft in nature, like limestone or sandstone or very porous rock. But if we're talking about granite, like we can find at Abusir, or we can find at Puma Punku or Ollantaytambo, when we're talking about, very hard igneous rock, then, all of a sudden the chicken bone and the copper tools and the saw, the copper saw, no longer applies. It can't work. And that's the stuff I'm interested in. I don't care how our ancestors were able to cut limestone. Of course they knew how to do that. And so I'm always amazed when the skeptics are like, well, this ancient alien theory that undermines human ingenuity, and it basically suggests that all of our ancestors were idiots and things like that. And nothing can be further from the truth. So it's all it's fun.
Okay, so what are the other two places now? We have Ollantaytambo, the Malta, of course, Pumapunku. What are two of the other spots that you would say are high on the list?
Right, and we have that stone quarry place in Egypt. I was mentioning the Abuzir one, and then that's when the door essentially blows wide open, because at that point it's all sort of equal. But if I would have to pick the fifth one, I would most certainly pick Baalbek, or also known as Heliopolis, in Lebanon. And the whole place there, what we find, there are remnants of an ancient Roman temple. But like with so many temples that we find around the world, just because something is considered, a Roman temple, that does not mean that the Romans built everything from scratch and then, they built it all. In most of these cases that we have all around the world, especially with stone structures, it means that some of these stone structures have been around for a very long time, and then they were actually inhabited by multiple civilizations, multiple generations, where no one actually has a clue when those monuments were actually built. Because contrary to what many people, including some scientists, say, you cannot carbon date stone. So if somebody tells you, oh, they carbon dated the Sphinx, or they carbon dated the pyramid, or something like this, please understand that they don't know what they're talking about, because you cannot carbon date stone. You can only carbon date organic material like bones or wood or pieces of cloth, textiles, and that stuff. And what archaeology commits is a logical fallacy. So let's say they stumble across a piece of bone that was found at a certain archaeological site. They will take that bone, that piece of bone, and they bring it back to the lab, and then they carbon test it. And now, just for theory's sake, we'll say this piece of bone yields a result of 500 BC. And right there, archaeology commits a logical fallacy by suggesting that entire monument or that site also dates to 500 BC, because in most likelihood it does not. It's the same if you move into a new apartment. When you move into a new apartment, chances are you are not the first tenant. That apartment has been inhabited on many, many occasions before.
What is it about Baalbek, though, that makes it such a standout?
Well, Baalbek, which is Baalbek, our listeners can go and Google that right now, and one of the first pictures you'll see is this massive, massive monolith that's sticking out of the ground. That is one of the biggest monoliths, or actually it is the biggest monolith that can be found on planet Earth. And it's a piece of rock that is about 1,200 metric tons. And I'm sorry, that's a crap load of weight. That's very, very heavy. And so what's even more fascinating, though, is right around that area where that Roman temple is, there's actually, you can see the Roman columns, you can see some Roman inscriptions, but the very base of that quote-unquote temple, there are what in archaeological terms is called trilithons. And trilithons are bigger than monoliths. Trilithon is basically it's jargon for a very, very heavy stone slab. And a trilithon, the trilithons at Baalbek, some have suggested that they weigh in excess of 2,500 tons, and one is said to weigh 3,800 tons. Now, our capabilities today with cranes and with heavy-duty equipment stops at 2,200 tons. So, right there, all these suggestions that, it was all done with ropes and pulleys and it was done with chicken bones, sometimes you just have to say, all right, this truly is a mystery. So how is it possible? And according to the ancient astronaut theory, I think that, there was some type of a lost technology available at the time.
You don't think maybe possibly. Now, have you heard about this guy down in Florida, the one that created the Coral Castle, I think outside of south of Miami on the way to the Keys?
Of course.
And he said that he created it. He found out how they created the pyramids by the levitation of stones, the reducing of the molecular weight or whatever, and being able to levitate them. What do you think about that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. You're referring to the Coral Castle in Florida, which was built by this guy, something, and his last name was Tsoukalos. And the last episode of season 2 of Ancient Aliens, we actually have an entire act where we went and we filmed at the Coral Castle, and it's truly fascinating. I mean, there is this place that was completely carved out of rock, and it was constructed by this one guy, and it's not even like, the guy, he's not a big dude. He's just this, 5'1", very diminutive kind of guy, not very muscular, but he built this whole Coral Castle by himself. By the way, he built it because he was in love, and he wanted for that, for his lover, for his the girl that he was in love with, he wanted her to come and visit him from Russia, but she never got there, so it was all a tragic story and things like this. But anyway, he built that place essentially for her, and interestingly enough, whenever people asked him, well, how do you do this? He would just, have, with a twinkle in his eyes, he would say, just like what you mentioned, that he has uncovered the secret to building, or how they built the pyramids. That's really fascinating because at one point, Coral Castle had to be moved only a few blocks, but still the entire place today is not in its original place. So when Coral Castle was moved, this is how Tsoukalos actually did this. He would call all of these big trucks to come over to his place, and then he would ask the truck drivers to go home and come back the next morning. And every single time, then the truck drivers would come back the next morning, some big gigantic piece of stone or coral would be sitting on the beds of these trucks, and then they would drive the trucks to the new site where the Coral Castle would have to be rebuilt. And he would say, all right, thanks for driving this stuff over here. Now I want you to go home and come back tomorrow to pick up your empty truck. And sure enough, the next day, the stones would be in place and the trucks would be empty. And, I mean, it's really mysterious. And we have eyewitness reports about this. And the really interesting part is that apparently Tsoukalos only worked at night. And whenever people looked in his direction where his property was, whenever he would work, there are reports where people apparently not only heard some weird, sound noises emanating from that construction site, but also they saw some very eerie green light. And so, it's all a very mysterious, fun story, for sure.
I think it's pretty amazing this guy has done this here. He did that for love. And I mean, it just kind of makes you wonder, when you see these other structures, exactly what the motivation was behind it too. But anyway, let me ask you this. The pyramid, the pyramidal shape, that triangular shape, why was it so popular back then? Because it seems to be all over the planet.
Yeah, and that is a very interesting question. And funny enough, I actually at one time I was at an archaeological site in Greece, and I asked the exact same question to an actual university professor / archaeologist, and I said, why would they build? Why are there so many pyramid shapes or monuments shaped as pyramids all around the world, number one? And number two, why in 99.9% of all those cases are the construction materials that have been used for these things, why is it always so massive? And believe it or not, the guy looks me straight in the eye and he says, well, they did it that way because it was the easiest. And thank you. That's the exact reaction that I had, because anyone who has been to any of these places and anyone who has even the slightest, who is even slightly familiar with engineering knows that that is simply untrue. Yet that is the story that is being propagated around the world with our poor students who have to sit in the classroom and learn this rubbish. So, I mean, do I personally know why the pyramid shape? No, absolutely not. I mean, it might have to do with some type of, sacred geometry, something like this. But why pyramid shaped? I have no idea. Was there technology used that we've lost or that we've forgotten about? Absolutely, yes.
Now, you've heard obviously about the Bosnian pyramids. Have you been to see them yet? Have you been there yet or not?
I have not, but it's definitely on my list to visit. Then again, I have so many connections all around the world. All I have to do is send one email, and I get lots of pictures, and that's really wonderful. So I've definitely seen a lot of interesting things about the pyramids from firsthand. I mean, from the Bosnian pyramids from firsthand pictures, for sure.
Okay. Now, the other day I had heard you mention something about on an interview the bridge of Bempul in India, and I went looking for information on that online. What is? Can you explain that to our listeners and to me as well, as a matter of fact?
Sure. No, the Bridge of Bempul is something quite fascinating because there is this gorge, this ravine in India. It's close to a very ancient sacred pilgrimage site, and back in the day, it was very hard for some of these pilgrims to reach that particular sacred site, and so one day, Indra, one of the main gods in ancient Hindu lore, decided to make it easier for the pilgrims to get there. And so he essentially placed this gigantic piece of rock on over this gorge, and he built essentially a bridge, and which is still used today. And the fascinating part of it is that some people have suggested that, oh man, it's just, a fallen rock that was at one point attached to the side of the mountain and it just fell, and so that's why this bridge was essentially created by accident. And that isn't necessarily true because, if you compare the rock that's around in that area to the rock of the bridge, both of these rock types are completely different, and they're not, and especially the rock, the monolith, is not, it's not part of that particular region. So we know And even, Indian scientists have come forward in saying that, this bridge is artificial. This monolith has been placed here. And, it's just one of those things where, you just have to wonder, how was it done? And, about the whole human ingenuity thing, once again, the terrain, the whole area there is so narrow and it's very difficult to oversee or to even implement such a construction project. And so I think that if there's ancient texts that speak about one of the Indian gods having to do with something right there, then let's find out what it was.
How could that be searched out online though? What is it? How's that pool, or can it be looked up online that way?
Yes, absolutely. It's BHIMPUL, Bimpool, and if you Google that, and I'm going to do that right now as we speak. So just to, there it is. It's actually BHIM, new word, PUL.
Okay.
And what's really interesting is that the very first hit that comes up is Bimpool, a natural rock bridge. And it's by Wikipedia. So, it's truly amazing how false information now enters the mainstream. It's really disconcerting. It really is.
Well, yeah.
So it's BHIM and then new word PUL.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you for that bit of information. So now there's going to be a third season of Ancient Aliens. Congratulations.
Thank you very much. I'm really stoked about that myself.
What new are you going to bring us?
Well, there are actually quite a few topics that, believe it or not, we have not covered yet in the first two seasons. And, also what we will do is we will look at a few other things that we've already looked at, but we'll go a little bit deeper because, as with every topic, there are topics that are more popular and then there are topics that are less popular. And as far as the ancient astronaut theory is concerned, the one topic that I'm asked about all the time is about our, human origins and how it is possible that extraterrestrials might have tampered with our DNA and such. And therefore, one of the episodes we're going to exclusively dedicate to the origin of man, where we'll actually talk with geneticists. We'll talk with, a whole bunch of scientists looking at the feasibility of having, the feasibility of exploring the question whether or not our DNA was tampered with in the past. And, we'll see what we can come up with. It's, unfortunately, I can't, due to contractual reasons, I can't tell you exactly what we're discussing, but I'm telling you right now that it's most certainly worth tuning in, and we will cover new topics. That's for sure.
Okay, well, that's a start.
I don't know yet either, but around the late spring, early summer, something like that. That has not yet been set in stone. We've only been in pre-production for season 3 for about a week now. So this is all still very, very fresh. We haven't even started shooting yet.
Okay. Well, I think this is absolutely fantastic. Like I said before, from the very beginning. I feel like the more that we get to know about ourselves as Earthlings, as beings of the planet, I think the more it will help us to go forward. The more it will help us to just sort of settle into ourselves. And it's kind of hard to really, be yourself. Have any real idea where you came from, And if you don't know where you came from, from, I don't know if you can really possibly have any kind of idea where you're going. So I definitely think the show helps a lot. It helps, it seems as if the popularity really is, I mean, people really do know. You do a lot of talking on the circuit, do you, these days? You go to schools at all, talk to the students?
It's funny you should ask. I have actually, just a few days ago, I've received an invitation to speak at a school, and I can't wait to do that. So yes, I am speaking a lot these days, and it's a great pleasure to be given the opportunity to go out there and talk about these things and and enlighten, especially a younger audience, because the topic is popular. Eric von Däniken wrote his book in 1970, Chariots of the Gods. It's one of the most popular books of all time, and things like this. However, that audience or that generation is now, a bit older, and it's time for a new generation to embrace this topic. If that's via TV, I don't care. It's great, because if TV eventually leads to books, I mean, that is what TV is all about and what it should be all about. If a TV show can instill for someone to want to become an archaeologist or to become a teacher or to, or online and order a book to read more about this, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I think so too. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, fantastic, because every so often there's technical problems here on the page, but everything seems to be smoothing out. Now, you've heard of the Ica stones. What do you think about them?
Well, the Ica stones are stones that are kind of like fist-sized on average, but they can be really big ones as well, stuff that you find. They're kind of like river stones. And interestingly enough, the Ica stones, by the way, they are from a little town called Ica in Peru, hence the name Ica stones. And Ica is right outside of Nazca. Anyone wants to go and visit there one of these days or this coming summer. The Ica stones are stones that on the stone itself, they have displays or carvings of some very interesting ancient scenes. Like, for example, there are scenes of, people on there looking through a telescope. There are scenes of people performing open-heart surgery. There's even scenes of, man and dinosaurs all in the same picture. And then there are some scenes that have been carved onto these Ica stones where it shows a map of the world and things like this. So very fascinating. But, unfortunately, as with so many things today, some of those Ica stones have turned out to be forgeries. But that does not mean that all the Ica stones were forgeries. And
how does somebody forge something like that, though? I'm sorry to cut into you, but how much time and energy does it take to create something like that and forge something like that? I mean, I can't get behind the mind of a person who would want to even do that.
Well, if that means that ultimately you can sell some of those stones to tourists, that's the main motivation.
Okay.
As weird or as simple as that might sound, but the way though that you can tell the difference is that if you carve a stone today and you leave it out exposed to the elements, let's say for the next 1,000 years, over that 1,000 years, something very interesting happens to that rock, and that is over the area where you carved your little scene, a fine film will actually start building over time, and that film is called a patina. It's sort of like a glossy kind of it's a film that just grows over it, and the thicker that film or that patina is, the older the stone. So at universities with electron microscopes, some of these Ica stones have been tested, And because of that patina, they were able to determine that some of these stones really are old, and that some of them were modern-day forgeries. And so, it's really, really, and that's where it gets really, interesting, because, some of these old stones are the ones that I've just mentioned, where, you see people performing open-heart surgery and things like this.
That's really fascinating, and I'm really glad to hear that, Steve, because I've never heard that complete an explanation. I've heard either that they were forgeries or that they, that they were the real deal. But what you're saying is, well, it's kind of like with crop circles. Some are real and some aren't, and it's
exactly.
Yep. And well, guess what? That's life. That's actually, that kind of makes sense all the way across the board.
And you always got to separate the wheat from the chaff. I mean, you're right. That is life. Because, neither extreme is good. I mean, you can't be completely on the right. You can't be completely on the left. I mean, the Buddha taught it's the middle way. Mm-hmm. So, to favor one position over another at all times, I mean, that is where, mankind still has a lot to learn.
That's a tough one. No, that's a tough one for humanity. They seem to like to crowd over to either side of the room, Nobody wants to dance together.
Yeah.
They'll get it. I'm sure they will. So now, what if you could just capsulize this in some format? Before actually I get you to answer this, I just want to remind the folks that are listening, and I'm sure we got some live listeners out there because you have a huge fan base, Giorgio, and we always have a few people out there that are willing to give a call in, and I want to invite you to call in a few minutes and ask Giorgio some questions. I'm sure he'll be happy to answer them. But back to what it is that you do and that you love in terms of really bringing this to the world. Why is this important to you?
Wow. That is a question.
Sorry.
That No, don't be sorry, but I like the question, and the only answer that I can come up with is that, I truly have a passion for this, to trying to find out whether or not, there's something wrong with our history. Something in our history, in our past, is not right the way we're being told it was today. And and that's a pretty big deal to me, because look, I'm aware that most people are interested in the latest football scores and who will win American Idol and things like this. And I've got news for you. I'm as much interested in that, but also I'm interested in other things, such as whether or not we've been visited by extraterrestrials in the remote past. Because if you look at that, I mean, it's mind-boggling what has become what this idea has become today. Because if it weren't for TV shows like Ancient Aliens, or for that matter, a podcast such as yours, I mean, life would be boring. Because if life is just to sit around in your lazy chair, I mean, I want more.
Yeah. Well, I totally agree with you on that. For me, I live in a world, in my own world. This sort of thing is reality. So it's kind of hard sometimes to remember that for a lot of people out there, it really still isn't. Every so often, I'll read comments or I'll read what the skeptics have to say, and I'll go, oh yeah, Russ, right, I forgot. People, they're still having a hard time with this. They can't wrap their minds around it. They're not ready for it yet, or whatever. But for me, it's kind of common knowledge. It seems like, and I would like to hope that eventually, it's common knowledge that something is off with our history. It's common knowledge that there's something more to our history than what we've been told. It's not exactly common knowledge exactly what it is and how it all falls into pieces. Everybody tries to put things into pieces, put the pieces together, but there's always pieces of the puzzle still left sticking out somewhere. How do you fit this guy in with what this guy? How do you fit all the different ideas about what the pyramid is? I mean, there's so many different ideas. and everybody's got a whole book about it. So it's like, okay, well, how do I make sense out of this? But yet something is up, obviously, and I think that that's the thing that I wish people were more open to exploring and to really finding out, because I think that could definitely be on those ideas, and those answers could definitely be uncovered. 2012, what about it?
Well, you want the long or short answer?
Give me the long answer, and then if we have to shorten it, we will. But go ahead, tell just.
Well, the long answer, or the short answer, actually does involve the long answer. The long answer, because the short answer is that absolutely nothing will happen in 2012. And the long answer is what I need in order to explain to our listeners why nothing will happen. And, it's rather simple. First of all, the Maya never said that the calendar will end, the Maya never said that on the 21st of December 2012, the world will come to an end, or that there will be the apocalypse, judgment day, and all of this nonsense. The Maya never said this. What the Maya did say is that it is the end of our calendar. And all of us, we've done this just a few weeks ago.
The end of their calendar.
Exactly. Thank you very much. Exactly. The end of their calendar. And we've gone through something like this only a few weeks ago, where, 2010 ended and 2011 began. And so, at the end of 2010, let's say your desk calendar, obviously ran out. So what did you do? You walked to the store and you got yourself a new calendar for the following year. Now, that is the exact same thing with the Mayan calendar, where, yes, that particular period in time will end, but it also means that a new beginning or a new period in time will begin. And, that's neither here nor there. I mean, it's pretty simple. And, everyone only talks about the 21st of December 2012, yet nobody, for the calendar to end, but nobody asks the question, well, if the calendar ends on the 21st of December 2012, when did it start? And the fact of the matter is that scholars have, over time, been able to determine when the Mayan calendar began, and the one date that they settled upon is the 11th of August, 3114 BC. And we would all have to agree that in 3114 BC, the Maya simply did not exist. So what was so important about that particular date? And according to, some Mayan writings that have survived over time, that was one of the times, or that's one of the dates when the gods descended from the sky. Gods meaning extraterrestrials. And so there are all these different, things that have to do with 2012 that are today. It's complete nonsense what some of these, doom and gloom sayers are suggesting, because none of that stuff will be true. Because the biggest thing of all is that, right now, it's not even Sunday, January 30th, 2011. It's not. So right there, our own calendar is off by at least a year, because if you ever noticed, when Christ died, we went from 1 BC to 1 AD. So there never was a year zero, which there should have. So right there, we're off by 1 year. And then the second argument is that, scholars in Italy and also at the University of California, Berkeley, they have determined that, in the Middle Ages, when it was the monks who were in charge of recording our calendar. And those independent scholars have determined that in the Middle Ages, they made mistakes up to 7 years.
Oh,
so
okay.
7 plus 1 is 8, and which means right now it's either 2019 or it's 2003. So, right there, we might be off it by as much as 8 years. And the third argument and final argument in this whole, counting mistake is the fact that do we really know when our calendar began? Do we really know this? I mean, now that, for example, we say it began on the 24th of December with the birth of Christ, but, or the 25th, I'm sorry. When we now know, when scholars have determined that Jesus was not born on the 25th of December after all. He was born sometimes in the summer. And then, did it all begin when he was born? Did it begin when he died on the cross? Or did it begin when the Romans instituted Christianity as their new official religion, which was hundreds of years after Christ? So right there, we might be as far off as 100 to 300 years with our calendar. So this whole 2012 thing, it is a complete farce. It is complete nonsense. And might I dare say, it's Y2K 2.0.
Hey, I feel that way too. It might be 2011 we may have to watch out for, maybe even 2013 or 14, but 2012 will be fine. Pretty much. That's kind of how I feel.
The only thing that I can tell everyone listening is that the only thing you have to fear on the 21st of December 2012 is waking up the next day with the most massive hangover you've ever had. That's the only thing. Mark my words.
Well, I totally hear that. Let me ask you a question that might be a little bit unusual. Name, say, I don't know, 3 or 4 or 5 sci-fi movies that you think are strong supporters. So some people want to go to a movie that's a sci-fi movie that will sort of like follow along the lines of the ancient astronaut theory way of thought. What could they go see that you would suggest?
Well, I would most certainly say that the first one on my list is Stargate. The original Stargate movie, which was a complete ancient astronaut movie from the first frame to the last. And I'm familiar that a lot of people love the TV series, but I urge everyone to go back to the 1994 or 95, I think, movie that first came out in the theater. That was really something else, because it addressed the ancient astronaut theory in a very serious way. And yes, it added fantasy to it, obviously, because it's a science fiction movie. But at the same time, it's really it's a great movie. But then at the same time, there's others like the new Indiana Jones movie that just came out, Indiana Jones and
the Crystal Skull.
The Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. I mean, look, the idea behind the movie was great. It's an ancient astronaut movie. I wasn't too happy about the actual realization or the implementation of the movie because it was kind of crappy.
Mm-hmm. Uh-huh.
But other than that, I mean, there's a whole bunch of ancient aliens movies that are really up our alley for sure.
Well, about the Crystal Skulls now, do we have all 13 of them? Is that the way it is now, or not? Are we still waiting for more?
No, we have not yet. We have not yet found those crystal skulls, all of them yet. We might one day. So it's a matter of time. Now, you did ask, though, what other movies would come to my mind, and one movie I forgot to mention is the 1989 movie by James Cameron, The Abyss. And that was definitely also a very interesting movie. And if you guys, or if any of you go see it or rent it, make sure you see the director's cut version, because the version that was shown in theaters back in '89 didn't make much sense, because for time constraints, the studios decided to cut out the most important scenes at the very end of that movie. You know. But another one that just came out recently is Knowing with Nicolas Cage. That came out last summer, or 2 summers ago, actually.
Yeah,
and,
that's the one with the oil rig. Yeah, that's the one with the oil rig explosion in it. Wasn't that the one with the oil rig explosion in the Gulf of Mexico in that movie? Or another one?
Also with Nicolas Cage?
Yeah, there was one movie that he did. I thought it was The Knowing, where there was a reporter in one scene doing a report on the fact that there was an oil rig explosion in the Gulf of Mexico. I thought that.
Oh, that might have been in there. Sure, I don't recall that, but now how would that be? How interesting is that that movie made that premonition in that one little scene, huh?
Yeah, well, that was around on the internet for a while. That's how come I know that, actually.
Oh, okay.
About that, yeah. And what about?
No, I don't remember that, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's in there. I mean, sure, yeah.
What about this latest? There was another Nicolas Cage movie out lately that.
Season of the Witch.
But yeah, how was that for you?
Season of the Witch to me was a great entertainment movie. You know, I mean, it was all about witches and demons, and him being the sorcerer, or not the sorcerer, but the Templar Knight. With his quest to bring this witch from point A to point B, and it was a great adventure movie. Would I pay any heed in it? Historically speaking, absolutely not. Okay. And by the way, talking about recent movies that came out, one movie that I'm always asked about a lot is, and I'm sure you've seen it or at least heard of it. It's called The Fourth Kind, where it stars Milla Jovovich in it, the gal from those. The name of that movie series escapes me now. However, she plays the lead in there. She plays a UFO researcher, a professor at a university in Nome, Alaska, and these UFO cases are presented where the film claims to be a complete a telling of the truth. Mm-hmm. And so many people get freaked out about that movie, The Fourth Kind, because at the beginning of the movie, Milla Jovovich, before the movie even starts, comes on screen and she says, what you're about to see is 100% the truth, and none of these scenes have been invented, and yada, yada, yada. And, you would think that Hollywood would have some code of honor, and they would actually, follow that advice. Because if you go and see a movie based on true events, then you really would think that some of that is true. Well, I'm here to tell you that nothing in The Fourth Kind is true. It is a complete fabrication from the first to the last frame. So whoever saw that movie and got freaked out, don't worry about it. It was just great, great entertainment, because neither that real, quote-unquote, real footage nor the university professor exists. It's a complete lie.
Super. Thanks for making that clear. Everybody, you hear that. And, Giorgio, we're going to, I think we may have some callers getting ready to call in. I want to invite people to call in. And in the meantime, though, there is something that you had said in one of the shows that I kind of wanted to get you to extrapolate on a little bit more, and that was about the fact that, well, hold on a second. Let me just go ahead and have this guy ask his question for you, and then we can get back to that other one if we have some time. Hello, is this Carl? Hello, Carl? 1 second. Let's see what's going on here. Are you still there, Giorgio?
Yes, I am.
Fantastic. Okay, well, once in a while, we get you a little, oh, there we go. Okay, a little problem here with my Blog Talk Radio. Switchboard page. Hello, Carl?
Yes.
Hey, how you doing?
Welcome. Pretty good. How do I... you to ask you a question about two things: the Dendera light bulb and the undersea temple at Yonaguni.
Did you get those? You got those questions, Giorgio?
Correct me if I'm wrong. The question was if I could talk about the underwater ruins at Yonaguni. Is that correct?
Yes, and also the Dendera light bulb.
The Dendera light bulb.
Oh, and the Dendera light bulb. Sure.
Yeah.
No problem. I mean, Yonaguni is very fascinating because what we have there, Yonaguni is a place in Japan. It's off of the island of Okinawa, and what we have there is this underground underwater formation where it looks like the formation was artificially carved. And yes, look, it's sometimes referred to as the Yonaguni pyramid as well, where this formation naturally or at one point definitely belonged to some type. There's definitely a big kind of mountain there. It is a natural formation. However, what came later, the fact that today there are so many steps on there and so many quote-unquote roads and very many 90-degree angles and things like that, underwater archaeologists have suggested that part of that natural formation is not natural, and so that at one point, this place had to be cut into the shape that it is today, and so that leaves us with quite a big dilemma, and the dilemma is, well, how was this done? Because today, the only way we can reach Yonaguni is if we go there with our scuba diving gear. And so, does that mean that whoever built this in the past, there's two ways to this. One, they either had access to scuba gear, which possibly, is a possibility, but I would doubt it. Or the only other way that Yonaguni could have been constructed, or not constructed, but carved, is if this was done when the worldwide sea levels were at a lower level, so that Yonaguni, that top part of that formation would be exposed to the air. And since that is the most logical of conclusions, the question then is, well, when was that? And there's a very clear answer to that, and that is that was before the last ice age, which is 14,000 years ago. And according to mainstream archaeologists, we didn't even exist the way we exist today at that time. So it's a great mystery. I mean, Yonaguni is truly fascinating, and I urge anyone, if we have any listeners from Japan, to go check it out. It's awesome.
Okay, that should have been higher up. That should have been one of those on your list of the top 5 earlier on. There must be that many of them around, I guess, is what it is.
Yeah, no, and sure. I mean, look, any of these items that we discuss with ancient aliens deserve to be in the top 5, but luckily we've got 50. We've got 500 pieces that deserve to be in the top 5. And so that's what makes this theory so interesting, that, there's only a few places, like Pumapunku, for example, that takes the crown. But other than that, everything is pretty much on a level playing field, for sure.
Okay, well, do you want to touch a bit on the Dendera light bulb, and then we'll take this other caller?
No, of course. The Dendera light bulb is a very interesting carving that can be found at a subterranean crypt in Dendera, Egypt, which is right outside of Luxor. And what we have there is this carving, or actually multiple carvings, but they only can be found in that particular crypt, with the exception of two more carvings, which are right above at the Dendera temple. But we have these carvings that look like these bulbous objects that are very reminiscent of big eggplants. And inside those eggplant-shaped objects, we have out of one area, there is a snake that comes out, and snake that kind of floats in midair inside that bulbous object. And then around it, you have a baboon that stands there with a carving of a baboon, or baboons actually, plural, standing there with knives. And then at the back of this bulbous object, you have a lotus flower, and out of which comes this big, thick stem that goes around on the ground, and then it actually connects itself into a type of a box. Now, when mainstream archaeology or Egyptologists look at this, they have a quote-unquote very simple solution to this, or a very simple answer, and they say, well, quite obviously, the ancient Egyptians, they were worshipping eggplants, and that eggplants were, to be worshipped, and that eggplants had a very, very important or significant place in their society. And someone like me says that this is not an eggplant, but it is, in fact, a type of light bulb, because what we have there are hieroglyphics that talk about the bringer of light, or the source of light, and that it is very dangerous if you approach. Now, the baboon with knives is a universal universal symbol in Egyptology, or with ancient Egypt, that wherever you saw a carving with a baboon and knives, that signified danger. Now, if those light bulbs were in fact, turned on by using an electric or some type of an electric energy source, then, still today, we can't put our fingers into the light socket, because otherwise, you'll fly a couple of feet here. So what we're suggesting is that what we have here are, in fact, carvings of some type of an artificial light source, because all over Egypt, inside the temples, but especially, let's say, in the Valley of the Kings, deep, deep, deep into the bedrock, you still have magnificent chambers with thousands of magnificent carvings of hieroglyphics telling you who built it, who was buried there, all those different things. But nowhere on the ceiling do we find any residue of soot, because mainstream archaeology suggests that all of these, tombs on the inside, especially, the tombs that you can find deep within the bedrock at the Valley of the Kings, that all of that stuff was very rudimentary lit with flames, with torches and oil lamps and things like this. Now, if that were the case, then the entire ceilings of every single Egyptian temple where no light is inside, where the light no longer reaches the inside, would have to have black, soot on the ceiling. But nowhere in Egypt has this soot been found. Not even residuals of soot has been found. So this begs the question: is it possible that the ancient Egyptians knew electricity, and thus also that they know about artificial light sources? And the answer is a resounding yes.
Well, I would definitely agree with that. Carl went ahead and let you give the answer. He went off air, but Carl, thanks for those questions, because they really were really great questions. Let's listen to what this other caller has to say. Paul, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you, David?
I'm fine, thank you. You have a question for Giorgio?
I do have a question for Giorgio. Giorgio, my kind of first introduction to the whole idea of ancient aliens, or any sort of alternative paths to the one that we've been taught in school and the regular normal education on the topic, came from reading a book called Who Built the Moon. Is that something you're familiar with, by Christopher Knight?
Absolutely, yes. He's a good colleague of mine, too.
Awesome. I was just wondering kind of what your take was on that. And, the book kind of postulates, I hope I don't ruin it for everybody, but that at some point perhaps humans travel into the past to construct the moon, since there seems to be no other logical explanation that scientists can give as to how the moon exists. And I'm wondering if you can comment kind of on why this isn't more why this isn't a bigger issue in the scientific community to address this, and if you have an opinion just about the whole circumstance of the moon, and if we should be going back there to study more and explore and see if there's any sort of if there's more to the moon that immediately meets the eye than what we've been told.
Right. Yes. No. It still, the origin of the moon in astronomy circles still is a very hot topic. It's interesting to note that still today there are questions about the origin of the moon, even amongst astronomers. Now, the reason why you don't hear more about it is because they've just basically stopped asking questions. They've just accepted the fact that the moon is there, and the hell with it, why? So that's pretty much it. Now, as far as the moon being artificial in origin, Christopher Knight and his co-writer, and I forgot his name, unfortunately, they did a marvelous job in illustrating the idea whether or not the moon is in fact an artificially object in the sky. And so we did explore the whole idea whether or not the moon is hollow or that it was an artificially made object in season 1 of Ancient Aliens, and I think it was in episode 2 or 3 or something like this, where in the last act of the show, David Childress talks about the possibility of the moon being hollow and things like this. Now, the one thing where I disagree about this whole theory is the fact that Knight has suggested that it was human being time travelers who created the moon. And the reason why I disagree with that is because, while I do not negate whether or not, I don't want to debate whether or not time travel is possible, because Einstein proved in mathematics on paper that, time travel is indeed possible. However, what nobody talks about is the fact that in order to perform time traveling, you have to have such a vast amount of energy. You have to have access to such a vast amount of energy that before we will have access to power a time-traveling device, we will definitely have traveled through the galaxy in regular rockets or in any type of other propulsion type spaceships 10 times over before anyone can master time travel. And mind you, that is not me suggesting this. Michio Kaku, the famous physicist, Dr. Michio Kaku, has come up with that statement that before anyone or any civilization, whether it's us or extraterrestrial civilizations in the past that came visit us, before any of those civilizations or us can master time travel, we will have to have mastered interstellar travel, because it is merely a question of energy. And time travel requires infinite larger amounts of energy than traveling between star to star. Or traveling star to star.
Does that answer some of your questions, Paul?
Yeah, it does. I mean, that was kind of the conclusion that I came to. Well, not about the whole time travel, but that, I found it maybe not the most logical conclusion that humans had gone back in time to do this. I guess I would just like to see a stronger push for humans to go back to the moon and find out exactly, put a little bit more effort into what's going on with that.
And I agree that, yes, I mean, definitely we have to go back to the moon, not only back to the moon, but we have to go on to Mars. I mean, this is who we are as a species. We are a species of explorers. We have the one trait that sets us apart from the animal kingdom, even though we are animals, is our the curiosity that we have for the world that we live in. And so I totally agree with you that we have to go back to the moon. We have to go on to Mars. And, the one thing where I disagree with Knight in Who Built the Moon is the fact that, okay, so he suggests it was time travelers, and we've sort of rendered that argument mute. However, the other thing that we have to think about then is, okay, so if it wasn't human beings who built the moon, then is it possible that it was extraterrestrials who built the moon? And if the moon truly is an artificial object in the sky, then the answer is yes, 100% that thing was built by extraterrestrials. It was not built by us, for sure, because time traveling, we have not yet invented time travel. And then, to suggest that, a million years down the road, we will go back in time and create the moon so that we have the moon today. That's that's a
time paradox.
Yes, exactly, because we would not exist a million years from now because we never had the moon to begin with. So by logic, it had to have been extraterrestrials. If the moon, that's a big if the moon is an artificial object.
Well,
Sure.
let me just throw this in here for both of you guys right now quickly because we're running a little bit out, getting close to the end of the show. But there are folks out there that already believe that there are bases on the moon, and a little research can pull that up. And also the same thing with Mars, that there are bases on Mars. So I guess the question is, when will we just really know what's going on? That would be my contribution to this, to your question, Paul, and to what you're saying, Giorgio. I mean, because there are folks out there, Richard Hoagland and others, that do talk about this. And so, I mean, it's not as if there aren't folks out there that already feel like there are bases on the moon and on Mars. The question is, how are we ever going to really know? When will we know the truth,
Right. No, and I agree.
Yep, that's why we got to go.
Okay, Paul, thank you, man. Thank you for calling.
Thank you.
And yeah, we'll talk to you another time, man.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Giorgio.
Okay.
Bye.
Giorgio, in the few minutes we have remaining, Atlantis lifted off. What does that mean?
Well, I think, if I'm not mistaken, you quoted that guy with the crazy hair in Ancient Aliens.
Yes, I did. Yeah, that guy with the crazy hair. Yep, I did.
No, but essentially, the big question that we have, I mean, look, there's thousands of books out there and hundreds of thousands of internet results if you look for the word or if you research the term Atlantis. And Atlantis is this long-lost island that allegedly at one point was between the shores of the United States and Europe, and so in the middle of the Atlantic. And so the big problem that we have is that everyone, and so what is suggested is that at one point that continent, which was fairly large, it sank into the ocean, into the Atlantic, and it disappeared. And the big problem with that is. And see, this is where I personally have no problem siding with, mainstream scientists, that the geologists or the marine biologists or actually marine geologists, they are pretty adept at determining, where an island might have sunk or whether the seawater levels rose over time and things like this. But by and large, the, archaeologists, the marine geologists, by and large, have not yet found any type of concise evidence that would suggest that at some point that there's a sunken continent, or even if it's a smaller island, that there's a sunken island in the Pacific, in the Atlantic, that would suggest that at one point was Atlantis.
Not even the Bimini Road, the
Bimini Road. I mean, that's Cuba is still there, but in Cuban history there is not a single word that they might have been Atlantis at one point in time, and their history goes back very, very far into the past. And plus, Atlantis was always known to be right beyond the pillars of Hercules.
Hercules, yeah.
Which is the Strait of Gibraltar, and if Plato would have said, Atlantis is, if Cuba would have been Atlantis, then he would have been like, all right, beyond the pillars of Hercules, but then you get
miles south, yeah.
10 years. It's far away, yes.
Yeah.
So, but here's the thing, that there are ancient Greek texts which relate that, because Atlantis is, according to tradition, disappeared in one night. And the reason, what I suggest is that there are texts that say that when this Atlantis sank, there was a lot of noise, a lot of smoke, a lot of hissing noises and things happening around it. And then it is described that Atlantis always had a skin made of bronze and metal. So my suggestion was that Atlantis, in and of itself, was a spaceship, a floating spaceship in the ocean that ultimately didn't sink, but it lifted off into the sky and disappeared like this. Questions about how mysterious our ancient past is and things like that. That was, in my upbringing, that was dinner table conversation. So, even though, sometimes my parents still today, well, not today, I mean, but like a couple of years ago or 3 years ago, my parents would ask me, what are you wasting your time for with this ancient alien thing? And, but I got to be honest with you, they're to blame. They started it all because they're the ones, who talked about these things all the time, and so here we are. But it wasn't really ever like an aha moment. It was basically just that I was introduced to these topics at a fairly early age through my grandma, and so to me, an aha moment never even existed because it was pretty much always, in my opinion, something that I inherently accepted.
So you accepted the existence of extraterrestrials then as a child. It wasn't a question to you then?
No question, no. Absolutely not.
And your family had no problem with it either then?
Well, I mean, that I would say now they don't, but for example, there's some people in my family who are devout Christians, and today they have no problem in believing in extraterrestrial life because here's my argument, and this has taken years and years of discussions and conversations where in Christianity, unfortunately, and not any religion today, mankind is regarded as the pinnacle of creation, as the as the apex of all of creation and things like this, and that there's nothing greater, nothing better than us, and that would be a pretty sad statement because we're not doing that well as a society right now, and the fact that extraterrestrials, if they exist or that they exist, would only mean that creation was way more magnificent than even believed. So understandings or theories of God.
So where can a person know that subscribing, say, as they do, to your understanding of the ancient astronauts connected to the Old Testament scriptures and to the Indian writings and things like that, but where can they go then if they want to find out about the real God or the God above gods? Or they can't trust the Old Testament anymore. So now, where do they find the truth?
it's not necessarily about trusting the Old Testament anymore. I mean, look, the Old Testament, it's an incredible book with fantastic stories, and especially the New Testament. I mean, all the stuff that's written in there about Jesus. I mean, I've read the New Testament. I think it's wonderful. I think it's amazing. So the thing is that you always have to go back further in time to look at the sources of all these different materials that we can read today, including the Bible. I mean, if one looks at the teachings of Jesus, and if one simultaneously looks at the teachings of the Buddha, then one has to come to the inescapable conclusion that they're essentially the same. And, one has to wonder, well, how is that even possible? And, some people have suggested that, who knows, Jesus might have spent a great portion of his adult life in India, learning under all these different swamis and gurus and teachers of Buddhism and Hinduism long before he came back and taught, his teachings. Because one thing is crystal clear, that we see Jesus at the beginning of the New Testament. We see Jesus somewhere in between for a couple of pages, and then he essentially disappears until the crucifixion. And so there are numerous pieces of evidence that should suggest that Jesus, during that time, did visit Tibet, Nepal, India, all those different places in the Far East, to learn about what he wanted to do, because it cannot be denied that Jesus was, in fact, a historical figure. That is, and to be honest with you, laughable, because, whoever has read my real biography, which is at legendarytimes.com, clearly can read that I did own Pro Bodybuilding Productions. Yes, I did run professional bodybuilding contests for 6 years, but I myself, with my small frame, I've never been an amateur bodybuilder. No, I would have made a total fool out of myself had I, put on the thongs and put on the oil if I would have gone on stage. I would have been absolutely laughable.
Okay. Well, I tell you what, I've seen some of the pictures on Facebook. You do look pretty jacked up, or did look pretty jacked up at the time.
Yeah, but that's nothing like today's bodybuilders. I mean, I would have placed dead last. I would have been behind dead last.
Of course. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. I've seen the competitions myself. But let me ask you then. Okay, so fine. Let's go back to when you were a kid. All right. Where did it grab you then? What grabbed you about it?
Well, the way it grabbed me as a kid was essentially where, I had the great privilege of traveling the world with my parents, and they pretty much went to every country in the world, and I was able to tag along. And then my parents made sure that whenever we went to a foreign country, we would visit all of the museums, or most of the museums in the capital cities, but then also we would go out in the field to some of these archaeological sites where my dad especially made sure that we would get some guided tours by some local archaeologists and things like this. And then, every time I would come back home, my grandma, she would say, it's really cool that you were able to experience these things, but let me tell you, there's another alternative viewpoint on these subjects out there, especially on some of these archaeological sites. And so I was introduced to the ancient astronaut theory and the alternative viewpoint at a very early age, where my grandma, she's the one that, who introduced me to, like, Atlantis.
Wow.
And, the ghostly realm and things like this. And to be honest with you, that type of conversation, or that type of those types of discussion, creation equals God. What God is, who the heck knows? But the fact that other extraterrestrial, other life forms exist out there, that means that creation was even more amazing than what we, paid credit to.
But now I know that you've had people take you to task for, say, destroying their faith or maybe I'm being exaggerating, or certainly.
No, you're right. You're right, and that is not that is not my place in the world, because quite on the contrary, like I just tried to explain, in order to subscribe to the ancient alien theory, you don't have to lose your belief in God at all. On the contrary, it just makes it even more magnificent or bigger because it means we're not alone in the universe.
But you can't believe in the God of the Old Testament, though, because that will cause you some problems, apparently.
Well, that is, yeah, and therein lies the problem that, the ancient alien theory essentially, suggests that whatever or whoever was described in the Old Testament was not God, but an extraterrestrial, a flesh and blood extraterrestrial whom our ancestors, misunderstood for being God. Not because our ancestors were stupid, but because our ancestors, didn't understand the nuts and bolts technologies behind those visits. And so, personally, I'm a very deep believer in God. However, I don't necessarily, or not necessarily, but I do not believe in the God of the Old Testament because the Old Testament God was an extraterrestrial. See, the idea of God varies from person to person. And then, yes, there's billions of people that say, they believe in one certain God, which is the God of the Old Testament.
Right.
But at the same time, I think the discussion should be first, before we start any of this, what is your idea or your definition of God? And I can tell you right now that I do not believe, for example, in a personal God. So there's all these, minute yet pretty big differences in. I'm doing very well. Thank you very much for having me on the program.
Not a problem, not a problem. I myself am a fan. I mean, when I first saw the series Ancient Aliens on the History Channel, I was like, wow, okay, finally we're going to get some knowledge out there, something to get people, connected to the history of this planet in a way that they weren't taught in school. So I was really excited about it. And then, of course, you came along, and I was like, well, this guy is really passionate. And I'm really actually excited to have the opportunity to talk to you today, just from coming out of that past alone. Now, let me ask you a question. When was your first aha moment when you were, you were involved in the bodybuilding, and then you went, I guess, from there into being an ancient astronaut researcher and a writer. What was that aha moment for you when you made that leap or that connection to the fact that, wow, this is something I want to give myself to?
Well, I mean, the bodybuilding, there was no aha moment. The ancient alien theory has been with me since I was a little kid. And the bodybuilding, like many of us have had or have day jobs, that was my day job for 6 years. I organized professional bodybuilding contests in the United States. And, so that was my day job. I mean, my passion was always ancient aliens, and the moment when I was able to quit my job, I quit my job, which was bodybuilding, and I ran to the ancient aliens. So it's truly amazing how the world works when you have a day job, and then all of a sudden people wonder, how is it possible if someone goes from bodybuilding to ancient aliens, when the reality of the matter is that ancient aliens way preceded any interest I've ever had about, bodybuilding or the promotion of that sport. So, and there all of a sudden there's this one Wikipedia entry, and everything is completely turned upside down. And it's really odd because the Wikipedia page was only started a couple of weeks ago, and in those 2 weeks, it's just been amazing what has happened. And it's just really, it's downright bizarre.